Right. So last week of this summer semester, mention a couple things off the top, and then we'll dive into material. So we're going to finish up Module 12 today. So we'll have that participation quiz. As soon as class is over, I'll release that Module 12 quiz. Those will both be due by the end of the day, Thursday. We might start today. Module 13, if we don't have time, we'll definitely have plenty of time to cover it the next 2 days. Just if we have time today, I'll start it so that we can even have more time to review. So Module 13 will be Tuesday. We'll start tomorrow. So that Module 13 reading right there is due before we start class tomorrow. We'll finish that up on Wednesday. Maybe, like I said, have some time to start review, and we'll then do review on Thursday. So that Module 13 quiz will be released Wednesday. We'll have the participation quizzes for Module 13 the next 2 days, all due at the end of the day Thursday. We then have Friday open for that final exam. I'll mention more specifics about that as the week goes on, but it'll be a few more questions. So 30-question exam. I'll have a slightly extended time block when you can take it. Also, it'll give you, instead of an hour and 15 minutes, I'll have it set to be an hour and 30 minutes. So you kind of have about the same time per question as the previous two exams. So we'll talk more about that as the week goes on. That's kind of a roadmap of where we're going. You need to make sure you can take that final exam within that time block, kind of similar to the other two midterms. Do not let me know on Friday that something came. You need to make sure you have it carved out. You have access to a computer that has that lockdown browser. That is all on you. That responsibility falls on you. Okay. All right. Any other questions for me before we jump into material here? So we talked a little bit about that figure out your grade tool as well. It's under the files tab where it kind of shows you with your lowest scores drop. Once that module 13 due date passes tomorrow, I'll change Canvas so that it is showing you what your lowest module reading dropped is. Once those participation quizzes and those kind of module quizzes on Thursday are closed, I'll have it updated so it drops the lowest there. So you should kind of know going into the final exactly like what your scores are with the lowest drop. And then it's just a matter of kind of what you get on that final that's going to change to your final grade in the class. Okay. Any questions before we jump into things here logistically? Okay. So we left off talking about kind of simultaneous decisions. I've got one more example where we'll look at this to kind of give us a refresher of what we were talking about last class. We'll talk about cooperation that can exist if we play the game more than once, and then we'll jump into what we call extensive form games, which we didn't look at last class. So this example I have kind of set up is thinking about how we would apply game theory. Another popular area where it's used is political science. So we'll think about kind of two candidates. They can run attack ads or not. Right? So if they Republican or Democrat here, I'm kind of using R&D to represent. If the Republican runs negative ads attacking the Democrat, 3,000 people fewer will vote for that Democrat, and 1,000 of them, 2,000 will just not vote anymore. 1,000 might be convinced to kind of switch their vote to the other candidate. Okay. And then same kind of idea. If the Democrat runs a negative ad, they gain 1,000 votes, but 2,000 people just stop voting. So what outcome would this have for our society? So if we're thinking about this scenario, if they both agree to not run negative ads against each other, nobody loses any votes, or nobody gains any votes. And I'll kind of write this out and kind of show you how we come up with these best responses just to kind of refresh our memory. If the Democrat runs attack ads, the Republican loses 3,000 votes, the Democrat gains 1,000, and all those, they're combinations of those strategies. Okay. So let's think about how we would solve a game like this. Okay. So if I've got run, do not run the negative ads, just kind of shorthanding things here. So we build our 2x2 normal form game matrix, right? We said if this is kind of the Republican, here's our Democrat, how many votes are lost or gained. Oh, I switched this up. Sorry. I want to match this up with the slides. I wrote them backwards. So in the slides I had, do not run ads up top, would end up with the exact same equilibrium, but just making sure that this is matching up with this slides so it's a little bit easier to kind of understand. So we had a Republican, our Democrat. If they both don't run negative ads, nobody gains or loses any votes, right? And I'm kind of writing this in a slightly different way than the slides. We can have these diagonal kind of matrices, or we can just, I said last class, use a comma to separate the payoffs. So if the Democrat runs negative ads, but the Republican doesn't, Democrat gains 1,000, Republican loses 3,000. The flip, if the Republican runs ads, all right, but the Democrat doesn't, Democrat loses 3,000, Republican gains 1,000. Now, if they both run negative ads, they each gain 1,000, but they lose 3,000. So they're kind of the net gain to both would be negative 2,000. Okay. So the way that we solved these gains, we said we'll go through and figure out each person's best response to what the other person is doing. So if the Republican doesn't run attack ads, what is it best for the Democrat to do? Well, they'd gain 1,000 votes here. They're trying to maximize the number of votes they get. What about here? Okay, well, if the Republican runs negative attack ads, it's better for me to also run, right? Losing 2,000 votes is better than losing 3,000. And then kind of the flip side, what if the Democrat is not running attack ads? What should the Republican do? Their payoffs were written second. 1,000 is greater than 0. What if the Democrat runs negative ads? Losing 2,000 votes is better than losing 3,000. So we end up with, we said the non-technical way of identifying that Nash equilibrium, where we have two circles in the same box, or we're both best responding to each other's best response. Okay, so our Nash equilibrium is going to be here, and we see both individuals run these negative attack ads. Is that a good or a bad thing for society? Well, here the candidates don't necessarily care, because notice, all right, I gain, you don't gain any votes, I don't get, we both lose 2,000. That shouldn't change like the outcome of the election. But for society, what's happening here? We just have fewer people voting. It would argue that's a bad thing for society, right? These people's voices aren't being heard. So sometimes these games, although they may not have negative implications for the players that are involved, they might still have negative impacts on society overall. So this is the idea. Some of our, if we look at some of our market-based examples, maybe profits are still the zero no matter, no matter what combination of strategies we get. But if profits are zero when prices are high, that would be a bad thing for the consumers and maybe a bad thing for society. This is an example just in a slightly different context. Okay. Any questions on this before we jump back here? Okay. So kind of had this scenario where the equilibrium is they both run these negative ads. That's bad for society. Right? So why might sometimes people cooperate? So we had the market-based examples last class of thinking about firms setting prices or quantities. Can they agree to work like a monopolist or not? We said a lot of the times it falls victim to, well, this is a kind of prisoner's dilemma in a way, right? We said that, kind of these candidates don't care because the net, right, relative to their opposition, they're not losing more votes in the opposition, but they'd like to have more people voting, like to have a larger voting base. So we can end up with this dominant strategy Nash equilibrium, where if they could agree to not run negative ads, we would have more people voting. They would like that. All right, so that would be like a prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so we said sometimes firms fall victim to this as well. Instead of agreeing to work like a monopolist, there's always the incentive to be the one that breaks the agreement, and it pushed us to this more perfectly competitive outcome where prices are lower, quantities are set higher, and we have profits of the firms being driven to zero, which they would ultimately love not to have zero profits, but work together and split monopoly profits with another firm. So why might, if we repeat this game, and the math on this gets a lot more complicated, I'll give you kind of a glimpse into it today, but if you repeat this game, why might we end up seeing that firms actually do cooperate, right? So let's assume that if I break my agreement, that in every subsequent round we play this game. So let's say we're setting prices for the next, I don't know, 10 months, just to make it easy, right? And we constantly, every month, have to kind of play this game. Or you could think about every day from gas stations, we're setting new prices every day. Right? We're just playing this just to make it have a number, 10, we're playing this game 10 days in a row or 10 months in a row, however we're doing this. Okay. Well, we would kind of call this strategy where if my rival ever breaks the agreement once, I don't trust them anymore. And so I'm never going to hold true to the agreement from there on out. So we kind of call this a tit for tat strategy. Once you do me wrong, I'm never going to trust you again. Okay. Whoops. So what might this look like, right? So let's assume that we're thinking about two firms, and we'll go with prices because I think it's a little bit easier to kind of visualize this. So firm one can set a high or a low price. Firm two can set either a high or low price. The lights are cutting out on me early today. Sorry about that. So we're going to have this normal form game matrix, 2x2 matrix. Okay. If we both agree, let's think about we both agree to set a high price. Okay. And that means that the other person then will trust me for the subsequent 10 periods. Well, let's say we have split monopoly profits and we're each earning 10. We could do a million here. I'm just going to make it easy. Just put 10 for each period. So that would be over 10 periods, 10 each period. We'd both be earning $100 in profits over that 10 game, time frame. If I set a low price and so does the other firm, well, now we can assume the extreme. We're back down to this perfectly competitive outcome where we're both earning zero profits. Okay. Now, if today in that first period I set a low price, the other firm sets a high price, well, I broke the agreement. So maybe in that first time period now, instead of 10, everybody buys from me, I get $20 of profits or 20 million. However, the other firm setting that high price, they've remained open, but nobody buys their product. Let's kind of assume we have this scenario where they then lose a little bit of money there. Okay. And then if I set, but then that's only in the first period. Every other time period, we no longer trust each other. So we're back down to zero profits for the next 9 time periods. So these would be the total payoffs, right? 20 plus 0 9 times would still be 20. And then if firm one sets a high price, but firm two breaks the agreement in that first time period, well, then I get $20 of profits that first time period. The other firm loses, but then for the next 9, we don't trust each other. We go back to setting a low price, zero profits. So where would this equilibrium be? Well, if in that first period that firm shows me I can trust them, they set a high price. What is it optimal for me to do? Well, if I set a low price, I know they'll never trust me from here on out. And so I'm actually, as firm two, better off if I set a high price. Now, this is only if I'm thinking about all of the total profits I'd be earning over those 10 time periods. Now, if they set a low price in that first time period, what should I do? Well, I should set a low price, right? Negative is worse than zero. And then for firm one, if firm two sets a high price in that first time period, what should I do? Well, I'll keep, they're trustworthy. I'll keep trusting them time after time. I'd earn profits of 100. Here I end up with what's better. Okay, so this is a game where we actually end up with multiple equilibrium, right? It ultimately comes down to there is no incentive necessarily to be the one that breaks that agreement in that first time period. And however, if the other firm breaks the agreement, I go straight to also breaking the agreement as well. So we're not really sure what these firms will do. If in that first time period, they both set a high price, we see them continue to set that high price. But as soon as one of them sets a low price, as soon as we end up in this equilibrium, we'll be kind of stuck here. So once again, this is maybe a potential answer where it's indeterminate. We have multiple equilibrium. We're not really sure which one we're going to end up in. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Now, this might be like, oh, kind of good scenario. Maybe we could agree to work with each other. However, if I'm thinking about what happens here, more likely to be the case in practice, and we could change these. Let's say, I don't know, if we both set a low price, it's not even perfectly competitive profits. There's only enough demand to support one firm. I don't know if in a perfectly competitive market, maybe we end up with these being negative, and then we only end up with the kind of equilibrium where we're both setting a high price, which would be good for the firms. This can still deteriorate because what's going to be the decision, even if we played this game 9 times in a row and we keep on agreeing to work with each other because we know that, oh yeah, if I work, if I hold true to the agreement today, they'll trust me tomorrow. Well, let's think about the very last time this game is played, that 10th time period, right? So we've agreed in the first 9. That's great, right? We've split monopoly profits. However, what's the decision if we continually are making, it's not like a one time, like, do I agree to set this price every single time, but it's every day or every month I have the decision if I break the agreement or not. Well, let's think about the very last time we play this game. If we both set a low price, kind of we're thinking about that's that perfectly competitive outcome. We both did 0 profits. If we both set a high price, well, now we're only at one time, right? We're just playing that one time period. So the incentives would exist kind of the same. If I break it in the last time period, instead of splitting monopoly profits, everybody buys from me. The firm that didn't set the lower price, nobody buys from them. They're going to end up kind of paying whatever their costs were of staying open. They don't make any revenue. So here would be our kind of payoffs. So if we go through and solve this game, right? Firm 1 sets a high price, what should firm 2 do? Firm 1 sets a low price, what should firm 2 do? Firm 2 sets a high price, what should firm 1 do? Firm 2 sets a low price, what should firm 1 do? Notice in the very last time period that game is played, we end up with a dominant strategy. Both people have a dominant strategy, set a low price in that very last time period, because we're not repeating this game anymore. There's no gains to be made from this person trusting me if this is the very last time we play the game. So what do we end up doing? We both break the agreement. We end up back at this prisoner's dilemma where we're not splitting monopoly profits. Profits get driven back down to the perfectly competitive point where they're equal to 0. Now, this is a bad thing for the firms, right? So this is why potentially even these repeated games break down, because if I know that in the last time period, there's an incentive for the other person to break the agreement, well, what do I want to make sure I do? If I'm this firm and I don't break the agreement in the last time period, I get negative. I try to break the agreement not in the last time period, but the time period before it. And then the other person says, well, I don't want to be the one that kind of has the agreement broken on me. So I'm going to try to, break it for the other firm. Maybe I'll break it in the 8th time period. And then the other set, and this kind of logic would follow us all the way back to, we see that firms end up breaking this agreement in the very first time period, trying to be the one that breaks the agreement first so that they can experience some positive profits, even if it's only for one time period, because they know as soon as one of us breaks the agreement, we go back to not trusting each other, profits are 0. So I want to be the one that breaks the agreement first, so I get those additional profits in that time period in which I break it. Okay. And obviously, like, the amount of profits would kind of change some of these, could change his equilibrium. But here we're thinking about this kind of scenario where we know there's always going to be, I have 2 prices here. Really, you could build this out to be like 50 by 50 matrix, but the same logic would kind of push us towards that point where they keep undercutting each other's price, breaking that agreement. Okay. All right. So, all right. Kind of good news, kind of bad news, which, we can see firms cooperate if they play these repeated games. But as we get towards the end of those games, we go right back to, if we're not playing this game with each other in the future, now there's no incentives to be the one that breaks that agreement first. Okay. And then we did the research and development stuff last class. Oh, here's one where I wanted to kind of walk you through this. Now, I'm not going to give you something like this on the quiz or exam, but I just wanted to kind of give you a glimpse into this, how we would do this with more than just 2 decisions. So we've got player 1, player 2 here. We can kind of think about a very simple game, which is rock, paper, scissors. So I would assume most people have heard or played this game. This is where we both are making a simultaneous decision. So that kind of lines up with what we were talking about with these normal form games. And we're kind of throwing 3 options. So rock beats what? Scissors, paper beats rock, and which one didn't I say? Scissors beats paper, right? So 1 represents I win, -1 represents I lose, 0 is, well, if we both throw the same thing, nobody wins or loses, okay? So we can kind of think about, we throw the same thing, nobody wins or loses. If player 1 chooses paper, player 2 chooses rock, player 1 wins, player 2 loses. If player 1 chooses scissor, player 2 chooses rock, player 1 loses, player 2 wins. Rock from player 1, paper from, so we have -1, 1, rock, scissors, 1, -1, paper, scissors, scissors would win, so we end up with what? -1, 1, and then here, if I throw scissors, I win, they lose. Okay. So these are kind of the different payoffs of this game, right? So we would go through it, and we solve it the exact same way. So for player 2, actually, here, we'll do player 1 first. So for player 1, if player 2 chooses rock, what should I choose? Well, I kind of intuitively, if I know this game, the only thing that beats rock would be if I throw paper. Sure enough, which of these has the highest payoff? If I throw paper. Well, what if player 2 chooses to throw paper? Well, then I know that I should throw scissors to win. And if they choose scissors, I should have been choosing to throw rocks. Right? Not rocks, a rock to win. Right? I then do the same thing for player 2. Right? I know that if the other person throws rock, what would win me the game? Playing paper. If they throw paper, what wins me the game? Playing scissors. If they play scissors, what wins me the game? Playing rock. Okay. So notice we don't have any non-technical way of saying it, any box or any combination of strategies where we are both best responding to each other or where we have 2 circles in the same box. So this is a game where there is no equilibrium, right? We don't know what the outcome of the game is going to be. It's largely random, okay? And this can happen. We can have games with no equilibrium, right? So that is a potential answer on some of these quiz and exam questions. But you could end up with no Nash equilibrium, right? Because if I ended up in any of these outcomes, I could always be better off. So let's say I'm here. Player 2 could always be better off if they change their decision. And then once we're here, player 1 could always be better off if they change their decision. And then if we're here, and that kind of vicious, cycle of logic would continue. Okay. So we do have games, and I wanted to show you, you would go through and solve these games that have more than 2 options the exact same way. It just takes a little bit more time. But I also wanted to use this example because it also highlights we don't always have to have an equilibrium, right? And that's why, these games, not necessarily my favorite, because you're largely just guessing what the other person is doing, okay? It's just kind of random, okay? All right. Any questions before we keep moving here? Kind of switch it up a little bit now. So all the games that we've been depicting up to this point have been simultaneous decisions. So how would some of these games change if we instead had sequential decision making? Okay. So the way that we're going to solve these games is what we call using backward induction. So we're first going to look at who makes the decision second. We'll determine what their best responses are. Excuse me. And then as the person that goes first, I'll say, okay, look, I know if I choose this option, I know what player 2 will do. If I choose the other option, I know what player 2 will do. Which of those 2 outcomes would be better for me? So we first solve the best response for whoever's going second. Then knowing those responses, we go back to, okay, what would it be optimal for that first person who's making the decision first to do? Okay. And, I think this will make sense as we work through an example. We'll use a decision tree to depict this. And I think I think these are a little bit easier almost in some ways. So kind of a dumb example, right? I shouldn't say dumb. This is, I've been told I sometimes shouldn't use those kinds of adjectives. I choose these examples for a reason, but when I say dumb, I mean a little bit more childish, maybe not market-based. But I think it'll help kind of, walk before we can run idea. So if you have never read a Charlie Brown cartoon, this is the running gag that Charlie Brown often will kind of be, running at this football. Lucy's holding it like he's going to kick it. And then she at the last minute pulls the football away. Okay. So she has 2 decisions, right? She is going second, right? Charlie Brown is running at the football. He's making, right, that decision first. Once he starts running to kick the ball, she then makes the decision second. Does she pull the ball away or does she let him kick it? Well, if she lets him kick the football, he kicks the football, positive payoff to him. He feels awesome. She's not amused, so maybe her payoff is 0 there. If she pulls it away, he falls down, negative payoff to him, but she finds it very amusing. Now her payoff isn't 0, it's something positive. So if he decides not to run at the football, well, then she doesn't have a decision to make. This is an easier decision tree where if he chooses to reject this offer to, run at the football and kick it, everyone has 0, nothing happens, everyone's payoff is 0. So we'll first solve, okay, if Lucy, right, is making the decision second, if she pulls the football away, she's amused. If not, she's not. So what's her best response? She should pull the football away. Now, knowing this, what should Charlie Brown do? Well, if he accepts the offer, he knows that she will always choose to pull the football away and he's going to fall. So he's really making the choice not between all the possible outcomes. He's really only making a choice between the outcome he knows will occur because he's looking at what player two or Lucy's best response is. So he's really only comparing whether or not he falls down if he accepts the offer, and then nothing happens to reject. What should he choose? He should choose to reject the offer. That's why in the cartoon, I don't know. It's hilarious because he always chooses to do this thing that's always going to be worse for him. That's the idea. He's not actually maximizing his payoffs or his, we think about the firm, his profits. Okay? So maybe a little bit more of an interesting example. Let's think about we have two firms, right? And they're choosing prices, right? So they can either choose this firm that exists can either choose a monopoly price or a competitive price, right? In doing so, right? Actually, yeah, we'll do this one first. I'm gonna switch here though, and I can kind of show you how we would build these out. So before I do the new entrant example, I want to do an example where we look at something we talked about last class, which is and even at the very beginning, if we try to have these two firms agree, kind of setting high and low prices, right? So we kind of had this example where they can set a high or a low price. But now, instead of this normal form game matrix where we're making simultaneous decisions, where we said, what does that Nash equilibrium tend to be? A prisoner's dilemma where they both set low prices. Let's think about instead if we have them making sequential decisions. Okay, so if firm one can choose either a high or a low price, and then in response, so let's say go to my gas station example. Let's say, I don't know, for whatever reason, the Speedway chooses to set their prices at 7 a.m. in the morning, but Circle K doesn't do it until 8. So firm one is always choosing to set the price either high or low before the other person. So in response to either of those options, firm two can then either set a high or a low price, and we can kind of think about what the resulting payoffs would be. Okay. So if they both set a high price, this was the idea, and I'll try to use the numbers we were actually using earlier. We're splitting that monopoly profit of getting 10 each. Okay. If firm one sets a high price, but firm two sets a low price, everybody buys from firm two, nobody buys from firm one, and they're going to have losses. If I set a low price as firm one and firm two in response sets a high price, well, everybody buys from me, nobody buys from firm two. And then if we both set a low price, we're going back to splitting demand evenly, but it's at a lower price, so we both have zero profits. So how would we solve the sequential game of this like price setting? Okay. Well, what we'll first do is say, okay, we're going to use backward induction. The person choosing second is firm two. Let's assume firm one sets a low price. Then what should firm two do? Well, 0 is better than -5. Okay. If firm one set a high price, what should firm two do? Well, if they're going second and they look across the street and Speedway's already, I think that's the order I did it in, set their price high, and I get to set my price an hour later, well, I'm going to undercut their price, right, and earn higher profits than if I also charged a high price. So knowing this, firm one says, okay, if I set a low price, and if this helps, you can do it this way. They know that if they set a low price, they can see the payoffs. We're assuming in all these games that all the payoffs are known. So I look at this and I say, if I set a low price, I know firm two will set a low price. So this isn't even a possible outcome. So if I set a low price, I know my payoff is 0. Now, if I set a high price, I know firm two is always going to choose to set a low price. So I know this isn't even a possible outcome. So which of these is better, losing 5 or having 0 profits? 0 profits. So we still end up with, you can kind of think about it this way. Here was firm two's best responses. What is firm one's best response in response to that? Setting a low price. And we end up with that same equilibrium that even if this is a sequential game, in the long run, there's always going to be kind of driving us to this point where profits are equal to zero or that lower perfectly competitive price. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Okay. So the next example that I had almost started in the slides that I'll kind of write out for you as well, just giving you another extensive form game that we can kind of think about how we would solve this. So let's say we have kind of this existing firm and they're a monopolist, right? And they can either set the monopoly price or they can set a, more competitive, or we can even think about this as the perfectly competitive price. Okay. There's then a firm who's thinking about entering this market, right? So that's kind of their, oh, sorry. This is the entering firm, right? So this is the existing firm. Here's my entering firm. Okay. They then have a decision to make, which is they can either enter this market, seeing that price, right? So the existing firm sets the price, and then in response to that, the firm decides whether or not they want to enter or stay out of that market. So we've got enter, stay out. Try to save myself some room here. So they can choose to either enter or stay out. Right? So the idea was if I set a monopoly price, the existing firm enters, right, and kind of undercut my price a little bit. I've got profits to this first firm, so we can kind of call this like firm one, and then the entering firm, firm two, just to make this a little bit easier. So here, the profits of the monopolist, they're setting a higher price. They're going to end up with negative profits. The firm that kind of entered, they can undercut the price a little bit. More people buy from them, they have positive profits. If the existing firm sets a high price, the other firm doesn't join the market, well, then they're still a monopolist. We know that monopolists are going to have positive profits. I stayed out of this market, so my profits are negative. Same kind of idea over here. If I set a perfectly competitive price, right? Well, if it's the perfectly competitive price, profits should be zero for the existing firm. The other firm stayed out, their profits are zero as well. And then what if this firm enters when the existing firm sets a perfectly competitive price? Well, if we're both setting a perfectly competitive price, unlike this scenario, right? We now are splitting demand evenly again. It could be the case where both of us now are earning negative profits. Okay. So if I look at this, all right, and I solve this game using backward induction, and this is where, let me see what I'm doing here. There we go. I will first figure out what the entering firm, the firm making the decision second, is going to do. All right, so I'll give them kind of red here. If the existing firm set a lower price, right, a more competitive price, what should firm two do? Well, I should actually stay out of that market. Okay. The price being lower, there's not enough, demand. If we're splitting it evenly, and we're both going to have negative profits. Zero is better than negative. If the existing firm sets a monopoly price, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to enter that market and I'm going to undercut their price a little bit, get a lot of demand, and generate positive profits for myself. Okay. So we kind of had here, what are the best responses of the firm going second, right? We've identified those. So now knowing that, what should firm one do? Well, this is where once I know what the person making the decision second, I know their best responses. I know they're never going to choose to stay out in this scenario. I know they're never going to choose to enter in this scenario. So if I'm thinking about setting prices as the existing firm, I know if I set that monopoly price, that firm will enter, undercut my price, and I end up with negative profits. If I set a more competitive price, that firm would stay out and I'd have profits of zero. Zero is better than negative. So we end up with just the threat of firms entering this market can cause the existing firms to set prices that are closer to that perfectly competitive point. And in practice, it may not be the perfectly competitive. Like this might not be zero. Maybe like this is like something that's like slightly positive and then this is negative, so they'll choose this one. But right, they're going to choose a price that's further away from that monopoly price, just at the threat of another firm having this ability to enter the market. Now, this also kind of hinges on like there are no barriers to entry, right? This other firm can enter that market. Okay. So there we end up with, kind of for society, a good equilibrium because we end up with a more competitive price relative to the monopoly price, right? We end up closer to that perfectly competitive point where total surplus is maximized. Okay. Any questions before we keep moving here? We on time. Okay, we're good. And since we worked through this one earlier, I'll kind of walk through this. It's nothing crazy. Just intuitively, though, before we even start to think about how we'd solve this game, let's say we have that same rock, paper, scissors game, but instead of throwing or choosing what we want to play at the same time, person one has to choose first, and then person two gets to go. Well, you know, if I know what the other person is doing, I can always play the thing that beats them. So we should end up with saying, it doesn't really matter. This isn't a very fun game because if we make it sequential, person two should always win. Sure enough, if person one throws rock, what should person two do? Well, the payoff is highest if I throw paper. If I throw paper as person one, what would player two do? They'd throw scissors. That would win them the game. And if I throw scissors, what would they do? They'll choose kind of rock here. Okay. So I've got player two's best response to each of player one's possible choices. Well, now player one, what should they choose? Do they look at this and they say, well, it doesn't matter what I do. My payoff is always -1. So I'm actually indifferent between all of these. Here we could actually end up with multiple equilibriums. So when we had this being a simultaneous game, we had no equilibrium. With a sequential game, it's not very interesting. Player one doesn't care about this game, right? It doesn't matter what they do, they're always going to lose. So they're indifferent between what strategy choice they make. Okay. So just, I don't know, I like this example because it goes to show how changing the type of game, if it's a simultaneous or sequential decision, can dramatically change the equilibrium. We went from having no equilibrium to multiple equilibrium here, right? It also can change, the payoffs that we can see for the strategy choices of both players. And so that's why I always kind of use this basic example. Okay. All right. So now we'll use maybe a slightly more interesting one. So let's do, before we go to this sharing example, I want to relate this to another game that we already talked about. So let's think about this high-low kind of idea again. So let's say I've got firm one, and they can set a high or a low price. And then firm two kind of makes their decision second. Okay. So if we go back to thinking about those games, if they were, so this is like my gas stations setting prices. So firm two can then either set a high or low price, high or low price. Right? So all of these are prices. I'm just, for the sake of not having so much going on, not writing price there. So if we go thinking about we were playing this game like 10 times in a row, each time period, if we split monopoly profits and set a high price, we had 10. So we said the total payoffs there would be 100. However, if I break the agreement once as firm two, well, okay, I break the agreement. I set a low price. Everybody buys from me in that time period. That's good. The other firm would lose, but they never trust me again. So when I'm thinking about kind of starting this game, if it's made sequentially, what do we end up with? Here are my payoffs. If then firm one sets a low price and I set a high price, well, they would kind of, everybody would buy from them. Nobody buys from me. I lose my costs. So I have negative profits. If we both set a low price, this is where we were saying, okay, now instead of splitting monopoly profits, we never trust each other again, and we just have these zero kind of economic profits, these zero long-run economic profits from a perfectly competitive market. So we'll go through. If firm one sets a low price, and we're playing this game 10 times in a row, well, then as firm two, just to kind of color code it, I'm always going to then choose to, well, they broke the agreement. I'm going to break the agreement as well. So if they set a high price, well, if I break the agreement, yeah, I'm going to get short run gains, but in the long run, they're never going to trust me again. So it could actually be that, all right, if they show me that they trust me, I will kind of respond in kind, right? This tit for tat strategy. If you show me that you'll set a low price, set a high price, I'll set the high price as well. So now firm one says, okay, knowing firm two's best responses, I know that they'll never choose to set a high price here, and they'll never choose to set a low price here. So if I set a high price, my payoff will be 100. They'll continue to trust me for the next 10 time periods. If I set a low price, they're going to break they're not going to want to experience negative profits, so they'll break the agreement as well. What's better for firm one? 100. So here, if we played this game sequentially, maybe we can end up in this scenario where we trust each other. We don't have even multiple equilibrium. We just have this Nash equilibrium where we both set high prices, split monopoly profits, and we can kind of trust each other for the next time period, or 10 time periods. Now, that sounds good, and that works out with these numbers, but you might already kind of imagine, well, after we play this game and there's fewer and fewer time periods left, eventually what would happen? Well, eventually this value might get lower than this value, and then there is an incentive to break the agreement. So this example, just to be fully transparent, kind of hinges on the fact that we're playing this game many, many time periods in a row, like 10 time periods. Once we start to get towards the end, we could end up seeing that Nash equilibrium change if we don't have these kind of repeated games. Okay? What helps this, though, is if usually there's not like a end date, right? Usually we hope as firms we stay open for the next as long as possible. We can make this infinite, right? So that the gains, right, if I can trust the other person, those potential gains are always going to be greater than the short-term gain of breaking the agreement in just one time period. Okay. All right. So the other example I had set up in the slides, and I'll leave this here just for a second as I write the other one out in case people are kind of copying this down because this wasn't in the slides. So let's think about, I have this option, and I'm going to do it this way. So I've got person one, and you can offer someone different kind of, so I think the setup is I give you $100 and I tell you, you can offer the other person in increments of $1, a certain amount of this, they accept or reject the offer. Okay. So let's say I offer that person all $100. Okay. All right. Well, if this person accepts the offer, then, well, I offered them 100. They get 100. I would get 0. If they reject that offer, the setup is that nobody gets anything. Okay. All right. Well, that was an extreme, but so this is person 2. This is person 1. Sorry. I could then say, okay, what if I offered this person $99? Okay. Well, person 2 then still has the same choice. I can accept or I can reject. If I reject, we both get 0. If I accept, I get 99. That person keeps $1. And then person 1 could also offer that person $98. They can accept, they can reject. If they reject, nobody gets anything. If they accept, they get the 98. First person gets 2. Okay. So actually, if I was wealthier, maybe I'd, and when I have in-person students actually run this experiment, see what happens. They've done this in experimental economic labs, and we'll end up seeing what the result ends up being. Excuse me. So let's think about person 2. If person 1 offers them 100 and they accept it, they get 100, 0. Okay, so what do? They accept. What do they do if they're offered 99? Well, 99 is better than 0. They accept. What if they're offered 98? 98 is better than 0. What we end up seeing is that person going second, they're always going to accept an amount as long as they're offered anything above 0. So as long as person 1, we could really, to build the whole decision tree, we'd have to do 97, 96, all the way down to 1. We'll end up seeing that as long as we're offered anything, we're always going to accept the offer. So what does person 1 say? Well, I know that if I offer them 100, they're never going to reject. So what do? Well, for me, 1 is better than 0. 2 is better than 1. How much do I offer them? This would continue. They'll end up only offering that other individual $1. Okay. So if we had kind of this setup, right, where if they reject, nobody gets anything. If you offer them an amount and they accept it, they get to keep the amount you offered. You get the remainder of the $100, right? Oops. That will end up seeing, that equilibrium is just to offer them just whatever that increment is, just above 0, or offer them $1. Okay. However, right, when we run this game in labs, we typically see that that's not the case. Okay. So I want to kind of give you some insight as to maybe why this would break down. So let's say I had this same setup, and now we'll start from thinking about it the other direction. So let's say I offered this person 0. Okay. So then person 2 says if I accept or if I reject. If I reject, we both get 0. If I accept, 100 and 0, right? I'm indifferent. Okay. So then here we had, if I offer them $1, person 2 can accept or reject. If they reject, both get 0. If they accept, they get to keep $1. Person 1 gets 99. Okay. And then just to kind of make this point, we'll do one more. So $2 is the offer. I can accept, I can reject. If I accept, I get $2. They get to keep 98. If I reject, we get 0. So this was the idea that, okay, at this point, person 2 is indifferent. So if I'm worried that, like, I don't know if they're going to accept or reject, well, I know here they're always going to accept. So I really should only offer them $1 to kind of guarantee that this offer is accepted. If I think about it, I could do like an expected value. Half the time they would reject, be indifferent about rejecting or accepting. My payoff here will be lower. So we see people only offer $1. However, that doesn't end up being a lot of the times, if you think about you doing this, like I took 2 of you and said, look, this other person is going to offer you an amount. Whatever they offer you, if you accept it, you get to keep. Well, if they only offer you $1 and you know they get to keep 99, that seems pretty unfair. So in fact, accepting the offer, yeah, I get $1. But if I reject the offer, my payoff isn't 0 here. What if I feel like this is such an inequitable outcome that if I rejected the offer out of spite, that I would actually feel some, like, if I could put a dollar amount to it, I actually would definitely value rejecting that offer, spiting the other person because they only offered me $1. I would actually value that a lot higher. Same kind of idea here. You've offered me such a low amount that the value of spite to me is greater than the amount you offered me. So now if we think about solving this game, if person 1 offers me 0, well, we could change this one as well, right? The value of spite to me, right? You offer me nothing. I don't want you to keep a dime. Now notice, what is person 2's best response? To reject. What about here? What would person 2's best response be? To reject. What about if they're offered $2? They still feel like that's so unfair. Their spite is worth more than the amount of money they're offered. So now notice, for person 1, I know that these are never going to be outcomes. So if I offer $2, $1, I know that they're always going to reject it. The only way they won't reject it is if I offer them something greater than whatever their value of spite is. So the offer that would end up being the equilibrium, if we built this whole tree out, would be the first offer that's greater than this value of spite, which I kind of put at $10 there. Okay. And, what would this look like? Just to kind of be complete in our example. Let's say, so then person 1, we get all the way down the tree. I offer them either 10 or 11. Person 2 has a decision to make, accept or reject. Person 2 has a decision to make, accept or reject. Once again, if they reject the offer, right? Sorry, positive, 0, 10. If they accept, this is what? 90, 0. And then here, this would be what? If I'm offered 11, this would be 89, 11. So now if I solve this game for person 2, we know that if they're offered 10, actually, sorry, they'd be indifferent about accepting or rejecting that offer. They still think it's pretty low, but it's the same value as their spite. So we're not really sure. We would say that they're indifferent there. Now, if person 1 offers them $11, we now know 11 is greater than 10. They're going to accept, right? So person 1 says, okay, I know if I offer them 11, they're not going to feel like it's so inequitable that just out of spite, the value of spite is worth it to reject the offer. And if I offer them 10, they're indifferent. Once again, we can think about, we don't know which of these we're going to end up with. If I think about the expected value, it'd only be 45. That's much less than 89. So we see that the person would be willing to offer them that first amount that was just above the value of their spite. Now, I'm not going to give you as complicated of an example as that, where I kind of tell you their spite and like make you kind of look at this in a different point. But it is interesting. We can take these just very basic, extensive form game understanding and apply it to these types of scenarios. You know, and this might seem like, well, this doesn't ever happen in the real world where someone's going to give you $100 to split with somebody else. But, you know, if you think about decisions, firms are making decisions where they're ultimately deciding, if I'm like, go back to that entrance, the existing and the entering firm, I'm really deciding how much of monopoly profits am I splitting with this other person, right? Or if I'm giving out contracts, like maybe am I giving out a certain amount of a valuation in that contract that at some point this person, they then have a second choice to accept or reject the contract. If it's a really shitty if it's a really if it's a really bad contract, the value of spite, right, might be more than the value of whatever that contract was going to give them. Okay, so I get going with these examples sometimes, and I don't know. I just think about it's kind of interesting. We can understand like individual decision making and individual interactions, even using this pretty basic extensive form game stuff. Okay. All right, so that should do it for the slides here. Let's take a look at this participation quiz. And we'll do, I believe, one extensive form game, and then we'll also do a normal form game example that I think is interesting here. So we also can go back and think about these research and development examples. Okay. So I'll kind of walk us through this one. So if I've got 2 firms and they're thinking about, we looked at last class, these simultaneous decision games with research and development. And we saw that sometimes, if there aren't any patents that protect it, we can end up in this Nash equilibrium as a prisoner's dilemma. Nobody invests into research and development. So you can solve these types of games. Like if you had this on an exam or a quiz, you can solve this on a computer screen. And I could like use my mouse to circle stuff here, but I'm going to write it out. I don't know. There's something about writing it out. I think there's some things you can do that make it easier to solve these. So I'm going to write this out and we'll switch over. I just want to make sure that I get all the valuations correct. So we got what? 50, 50, negative 20, 60, 60, negative 20, 10, 10. Okay. So let's say we had this set up and we're thinking about what is the equilibrium of this game going to be. Okay. So the idea here is if we both don't invest into research and development, there's no new products. Okay, we're still earning positive profits maybe in this industry, but we're only earning 10 million. If we both invested and came up with these new products that consumers love, more people are going to buy. We now are earning higher profits. Now, if I'm the firm that invests, did I make sure I didn't flip these from what was on the, yeah, I was writing quick. This should be firm 1, my bad. So if we're thinking about firm 1 invests, firm 2 doesn't, well, we have this new product. If there's no patent, firm 2 just copies what I came up with. They're able to sell this product without incurring any additional costs. I might still have this product and I can sell more of it, but I have these huge costs, right? And so firm two in that scenario is going to be better off than me. Okay. I'm going to lose money. They just steal my invention, right? They didn't come up with anything that I can also use. And so they're going to end up with positive profits. They avoided all these huge research and development costs. I end up with negative profits. Same idea over here. If I don't invest, but they do, well, I actually can use whatever they come up with without paying for anything. They, were the only one that came up with this new product now, but they had these huge costs, and I didn't come up with anything on my own that they could kind of mimic. So how would we solve this game? So if firm one, we go backward induction. Firm two is making the decision second. So if firm one chooses not to invest, what should firm two do? Choose not to invest. If firm one chooses to invest, what should firm two do? Well, they would actually choose not to invest, right? And then knowing this, firm one says, I know if I'm making the decision first, if I have to decide whether or not I'm putting money into my research and development, and then firm two like makes the choice next month or something, right? Or this is like a sequential decision. Well, I know that this will never happen. I know that this will never happen. So if I choose to invest, I know firm two will not invest. I'll lose money. I know that if I don't invest, they won't either. I've avoided these huge costs. There's no new product out there. Our Nash equilibrium ends up being we both choose not to invest. This would be an example of, so just like these simultaneous games, with these extensive form sequential games, this is still a prisoner's dilemma. Because if we could somehow agree to coordinate our actions, we could both be better off. Not only is this an example of a prisoner's dilemma, this would be another example where this is, yes, a bad thing for the firms, but this is also a bad thing for, who have we not factored in here? Society, right? We don't end up with any money put into research development, no new products, consumers, there's essentially consumer surplus that's not being realized out there, okay? So there we end up with our Nash equilibrium would be both firms choose not to invest, okay? Any questions on that before I keep moving? Okay. We got 18 minutes left. I think it's worthwhile. We might not jump into module 13 here today. We'll have plenty of time the next 2 days, and I think it's worth going over since we have a more condensed class. This is good to do this now since the exam will be kind of not too far around the corner. So let's say I have a similar setup, but that we have patents, okay? So I like to kind of give examples of like real world stuff. And I think this is kind of highlights like the usefulness or the positive impact that maybe patents could have, right? So this was I invest or do not invest. And then we had down here the same decision if it was made sequentially of that second firm. And we kind of saw a similar thing even in the simultaneous games model. So let's say we both invest, and let's say whatever this new product is, and I'm just going to leave off the millions just for the sake of making it a little bit easier to look at these numbers. So let's say we have a patent. If we both invest into whatever this new product is, the other person can't like steal our invention or can't mimic it, right? So we put a bunch of money into research and development, but we got this new product we can sell for more. If neither of us invest, maybe we're kind of back to thinking about, I don't know, maybe there's some profits to be made there. We're splitting like the existing monopoly profits, like even if we are agreeing to like coordinate on things other than research and development. So we start out with that same scenario. Now, if we have patents, right, then the idea when firm one invests, they come up with this new product that they're able to sell, but firm two doesn't, right? Well, here, if both of us were protected, right, then both of us, like, no, the other firm, here, maybe I've got this new product. It's not that I get 50 now. Maybe it's something like, let's say 80. Because now I'm the only one that has this new product, and the other firm, right? Maybe everyone, that likes my new product so much, if they don't invest and they can't mimic my product, they actually lose enough business to me to where maybe their profits now become negative. And then same kind of idea over here. If I don't invest, but firm 2 does, they come up with this new product. Everybody loves this new product, buys from them. I can't mimic it though. My existing product loses its kind of value. Maybe I'm earning negative profits. Okay. So if this was kind of our scenario where whoever invests comes up with this new product, it's protected. The other person can't mimic it. So if we think about, got too many colors in my hand here. What would firm 2 do? If firm 1 chooses not to invest, what should firm 2, wait, yeah, what should firm 2 do? Sorry. Well, 80 is better than 10. If firm 1 invests, what should I choose to do? 50 is greater than negative 10. Okay, so we know what firm 2's best responses will be. So now firm 1 says, what should I choose to do? But knowing that if firm 2 goes second, they'll never choose to not invest here, and they'll never choose not to invest here. So now what does firm 1 choose to do? Well, if they don't invest, they know firm 2 will, they'll lose money. If they invest, they know firm 1 will also choose to invest. 50 is greater than negative 10. If we have patents that protect these firms, we can now end up with this Nash equilibrium where both of them are investing into research and development. Whereas before, we ended up in this scenario where neither one was investing. Who's not factored in here where this is an even better? Well, first of all, it's good for the firms, but it's also good for the consumers, right? We now have multiple companies coming up with new products. So we would think about this as like a more beneficial outcome for society as well. And how did we really get these payoffs to change? By enacting that patent law. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? All right, so the next question is kind of a weird one, but it is interesting, and they run these experiments in economic labs, and you start to think about, there's some really interesting literature about like different people or different levels of thinkers. So I'll kind of just use a basic example to kind of set this up, and then we'll think about if it was a little more complicated. So I think the question is, if everybody, let's say that was logged on right now, or I could somehow put up a quiz where I could, like this participation quiz, and I can actually look at the results. So before just like randomly guessing, it might be interesting if you actually take some time to think about this. Although you'll have heard this discussion when I go through it. So any number you guess between 0 and 100, you'll get credit for. So maybe, maybe if I can look at the actual results here, they'll be a little skewed because some of you will guess after you then hear the explanation. But if you could guess a number between 0 and 100, and if you can guess the average of the entire class, you have to guess half of that average. If you guess half of that average, you win and you get a certain amount of money. They run this in experimental like economic labs. So the idea there is, okay, I know that if people were truly just randomly guessing between 0 and 100, if everybody chose a random number, the average, right, should be what, 50? So I know that if the average is 50, right, just randomly guessing, what would half that average be? Right? So I think about, okay, if I were to guess, and we're all making this decision simultaneously, right? So we can think about, even if it was just 2 people, to make this a little bit easier to think about. So let's say we had 2 people guessing numbers. And to make this originally, to kind of set this up, so it's any number between 0 and 100. So we just said, okay, the average would be 50, right? So I've got to guess half the average. So let's say I guess 25. Okay? And we both think about, okay, if I guess 25. However, I know that if we both guess 25, what should the actual answer be? Well, the average, what's half the average? Oh, that would actually be 12.5. Okay. So we could think about, and one of the caveats to this game would be it's even if you don't get exactly half the average, it's whoever is closest. Okay. Well, if we both guess 25, we're both going to be equally as far off here. So nobody wins this game, right? We're just thinking about winning the game just to make the payoffs easy. We'll say 1. If I lose, it's -1. If nobody wins or loses, so just 0. Right? So if instead I guessed the lower value, right? Well, then I'm going to be close, right? 37.5 divided by 2. I'm actually going to be a little bit closer to that average. I would kind of win this game. The other person 2 here loses. If they guessed half the average, right, I lose, they win. If we both guess 12.5, we're kind of back down to this point where neither of us win, right? The average is 12.5. What's half of that? We're equally as far away now from 12.5, and so okay, nobody wins. So if we kind of went through and solved this game, right? Person 2 guesses the higher number. What should I do, right? Guess the lower one here. Guess the lower. What should person 1 do? Guess lower. Guess lower, right? So we end up with this Nash equilibrium where we do what? We both end up guessing the lower value. Well, these aren't the only two numbers we can choose from. In fact, we can choose any number, but just to kind of highlight this, let's say if this can, we see this Nash equilibrium is pushing us to guess lower and lower numbers. What ends up being true is we both end up at this point where we should continue to guess lower and lower values. So here, if I guess the lower value than them, right, I'm going to end up, what do I want here? So this would be person 1 guesses the lower value. Now, if we're making the decision now between we're both guessing 12.5 and 0, ultimately we kind of think about, when we both guess 0, well, then half the average would be 0, where you can both end up both winning this game. So the long run equilibrium should be that we both continue to keep guessing half of the average all the way down to 0. The problem is when we see this game played out in practice, right? We typically see like the equilibrium guess be, I don't know, somewhere between 12.5 and then like 6.75. So people, or 6.25. So people will think, okay, if everyone guesses half the average, everyone would guess 25. But then if everyone guesses that, then half the average would be 12.5. But if everybody guesses that, it would be 6.2. And how many times you think that is what we would call like level K type thinkers. And a lot of people will be like level 2 or 3. So like they'll think through a couple of these. A level infinite type thinker would realize that if we were to draw out I have 3 options here, but every single possible number that everybody could guess, we should end up in this long run, best response to each other's best response equilibrium where we're both guessing 0. But in practice, not everybody can think through that far. And so we don't see that ends up being the actual Nash equilibrium. So when we're talking about some of these games, we have to realize that we're always trying to identify what a self-rational, interested individual, their best responses would be. The problem is if they're not able to accurately identify what the payoffs are or think about the game in an accurate way, in practice, we can see sometimes people stray from these equilibrium because they're not really making the correct decisions, right? So if we had people who were able to think through this completely, all of you, I'm guessing now, hopefully would understand what should the equilibrium be? Even if we don't have 2 people, but if we have 50, 100, all of us, in order to win, if we are all thinking level infinite type thinkers, we should all be guessing 0, and we actually would then all win. Okay. I don't know. Hopefully that's kind of an interesting example. Not something that necessarily would show up on a quiz or an exam, but kind of thinking how far we can push this game theory. So you actually need to understand this. You start to get into things like more advanced algebra. We're talking about more than 2 people. We're talking about more than 2 decisions. There are entire classes dedicated to game theory where you would actually have a mathematical proof that shows what the equilibrium in this game would be. But I think it's kind of an interesting one to bring up so you can start to think about that next level of topics that you would experience if you looked into game theory. And like I said, this is, I don't know, I should probably look up in the class schedule. I know a lot of times political science departments will have their own game theory class because there's a lot of issues that pop up in political science. I know the econ department definitely has one. All right. So that should do it for us. Once again, any number you put in between 0 and 100 here will be counted as correct. And then the first example we said they both would not invest was a Nash equilibrium. So that should do it for our participation quiz. I will have this module 12 quiz released right now since we've covered all the material. That module 13 reading due before we start class tomorrow. And then just to give a little bit of insight, we won't go too crazy into it today, but I'll just set up the idea of what we'll be talking about tomorrow, which is we've talked about perfectly competitive markets and monopolies, right? So with a monopoly, we had one firm, they were setting the price and quantity. Monopolistically competitive markets, perfectly competitive markets, many firms selling the exact same product, and we said nobody has influence over the price or the quantity, right? All market quantity. The in between, so these oligopolies where we had a few number of sellers, and most of our models we were looking at like 2, that's going to be somewhere in between, right? We said sometimes, depending on the payoffs, those long run equilibriums can be that those firms act more like a perfectly competitive market, more like a monopoly market. A more specific in between these two would be what we call a monopolistically competitive market. So we're going to have many buyers and many sellers still, but we're going to have slightly differentiated products. So these are going to look a lot more like real world markets, because even if we have many firms, many buyers, right, we don't just have one firm selling this good. So think about like gas, right? Gas is a homogeneous product, I would argue, and I always use that as like a perfectly competitive market. However, what do gas companies try to do, gas stations? They try to offer other amenities or convince you that their product is better, right? Or this, I always say bottled water is the same thing. Bottled water is all the same, but Aquafina tries to convince you that theirs is much better than Dasani, right? So if we're thinking about products that, okay, maybe it's not exactly the same, they're slightly differentiated. Maybe there is, a slight taste difference in Dasani and Aquafina water. What's going to happen in that market? Okay. So what we'll end up seeing with these monopolistically competitive markets is we're still going to have many buyers and sellers, free entry and exit of firms, but we're now going to have slight product differentiation. That probably mimics more what we see in the real world. Same kind of idea. Qdoba, Chipotle, right? They both make burritos, burrito bowls, quesadillas, whatever, but they're slightly differentiated products. Okay. So fast food, clothing, different apartments, they offer slightly different amenities. So it's still a place to live, but some apartments have more windows, or some apartments have better carpeting, or whatever, whatever it is. So we're gonna have slightly differentiated products. So what'll end up being true, right, is looks like monopolistic competitive markets are kind of a mashup of a monopoly and a mashup of a perfectly competitive market. So we'll tomorrow start with, okay, what do the outcomes for these monopolistically competitive markets look like? We'll see that they have a mixture of both perfectly competitive and monopoly traits, but ultimately the kind of price and quantity decisions that these monopolistic competitive markets, the firms will choose, is also going to be kind of like a hybrid of these two. Okay, so we'll start with that tomorrow, that module reading due before we start class. Other than that, end the recording there.